Since I know that all of you all have steel traps for minds and remember everything that was going on in our Scottish Rite history that we had going this past year, probably remember everything, but I thought still we'd have a bit of a review. And since we've had a 3-month break, let me review briefly our past journey in Scottish Rite history. Scottish Rite, as we know it today, began in 1801 in Charleston, South Carolina, approximately 80 years after the Grand Lodge of England was created in 1717, which had formed the foundation of Masonry upon which the higher or further degrees could come into existence. For over 50 years after 1801, the Scottish Rite languished as an adjunct to basic Masonry. It had little appeal with no aggressive leadership. Despite its high pretensions, the Supreme Council of the Scottish Rite was almost a local Charleston, South Carolina operation, until Albert Pike took over in 1859 on the eve of the Civil War. Seldom did the membership total over 500 members during those first 50 years. Since there was no headquarters building, the officers kept the records showing membership and financial status in their homes, and therefore many of them were lost because of fire and other reasons. This is when we actually started our detailed study of Scottish Rite history with the emergence of Pike as the Grand Commander in 1859. For the next 10 years, from 1859, the fraternity was basically in a holding pattern because of the Civil War and the bad times in the South following the war. In 1870, Pike made the monumental move of the headquarters from Charleston to Washington, D.C. of the now again United States, because for a few years there they weren't united. We presume this move was to remove the image of the organization as a purely Southern states operation to the appearance of a national organization. Under Pike's leadership, the ritual was updated, bylaws changed, and generally transformed into a Masonic fraternity with a future. Since Pike was a person of high intellect and scholarly interests, he decided that the Scottish Rite should seek out members who were in the area of scholarly pursuit. We know he was interested in creating new members, particularly in the new emerging states, but still he wanted the growth to be slow so as to maintain this scholarly pursuit. When Pike died in 1891, the Southern jurisdiction had increased its membership to approximately 4,000 members. A headquarters building had been purchased and over a few years paid for in Washington, D.C. This was that brownstone first headquarters building. And the Southern jurisdiction now covered 27 states. Another phenomenon occurred, but only in the Northern jurisdiction, and that is the advent of theater-style degree presentation. Pike had strongly opposed this new activity. However, upon his death, it became the norm rather than the exception in the Southern jurisdiction. This allowed for much larger classes than the lodge room presentations, and was one of the reasons membership began to soar. To accommodate the stage and theater seating, much larger buildings began to appear. The Scottish Rite began its explosive membership growth, which actually continued until the Great Economic Depression. A new headquarters building was completed in 1915, just 15 months after Grand Commander Richardson died. This is where our 5th installment of the Scottish Rite history left off last November. So now let's take a look at this next rich history of the Scottish Rite. We've entitled this period that we're going to talk about today as Seeking a New Identity, or From Prosperity to Depression, the years 1914 to 1930. When Sovereign Grand Commander James D. Richardson died in July of 1914, he had been the most productive leader since Pike. Richardson is credited with creating the national magazine called The New Age, now the Scottish Rite Journal, formal implementation of theater style or theater degree presentation, and almost single-handedly planning and constructing the House of the Temple. Unfortunately, he died just months before the House of the Temple was dedicated. He had served double duty for part of his 13 years as Grand Commander by serving as a full-time member of Congress from Tennessee for 4 of those years. His leadership allowed the Scottish Rite to grow and prosper to a greater degree than any other fraternal group of that period, like the Odd Fellows, the Red Men, and so forth. The Scottish Rite became the #1 fraternal organization in the United States in terms of strength, quality, and prestige. Succeeding Richardson was his Lieutenant Grand Commander, George F. Moore, a lawyer from Alabama, who had served on the Supreme Council for 26 years. He inherited a strong organization which was going 100 miles an hour, but one that had outgrown its original purposes and was seeking a new identity as a challenge in the 20th century. These conditions, plus the eruption of World War I, created much division in the Supreme Council, and so new Grand Commander Moore had stepped into a very difficult situation. He ventured into, or was pushed into, some areas that the Scottish Rite had never entered. The Supreme Council went on record as being anti-war, as World War I loomed ominously over the country. This put them in the political arena. They became a big proponent of Americanism, flag, country, patriotism, and so forth, which, by the way, has continued to this day. They then slid into some relations with people that they shouldn't, such as the Ku Klux Klan, and that proved to be a big mistake. Another mistake was thinking that Americanism meant Anglo-Saxon or white Americans, and seemed to exclude other ethnic parts of the population. They were particularly strong on limited immigration. Another principle which was promoted as a part of the Americanism theme was strong support of the public schools, and that's another area which is still active today. But unfortunately, back in those days, sometimes this was interpreted as anti-Catholic. Because we supported public schools, we were anti-Catholic schools, which again maintained the rift between the fraternity and Catholicism. So anytime you hop into the political arena, you can create enemies right quick, both outside and inside the organization. Grand Commander Moore even offered his services to President Woodrow Wilson to help in keeping the peace initially, and then after the war went to Europe to establish an American Masonic headquarters in Paris to foster relations between American and European Masons and to promote peace forevermore. Well, most of the Supreme Council thought that Moore had overstepped his bounds, and they referred to the Paris Project as a fool's errand. At the 1919 biennial, the Paris Project was scrapped. During the 1919 session, Grand Commander Moore suffered one rebuff after another, and the writing was on the wall. He was going to have to leave. One of the leaders of the anti-Moore movement in the Supreme Council was another strong personality in the form of the current Secretary General, John Henry Coles. More about him in a moment. At the beginning of the 1921 biennial, George F. Moore's resignation was received and accepted. So this brings us to the end of another era in Scottish Rite history. As mentioned earlier in earlier talks, James D. Richardson is considered the second great leader after Albert Pike. Trying to follow a legend is always tough, so George Moore experienced that same condition, as did the immediate followers of Pike. To his credit, Moore was willing to explore new areas of operation. Some of these areas were accepted, and others were not. But at least his successor knew where not to go, such areas as the Ku Klux Klan and direct political involvement. As Moore's administration ended, let's take a look at how he left this organization called the Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, Southern Jurisdiction. From the turn of the century, that's 1900, up to 1921, membership had skyrocketed, listen to this, from 10,000 members. See, it's 4,000 in 1891 when Pike died, and then by the end of the century it was up to 10,000. Now, from 2000 until 1921, I mean 1900 until 1921, I'm sorry, the membership skyrocketed from 10,000 to 200,000 members. Many new buildings or temples were built, and many more were on the drawing boards. The organization had become a giant in the Masonic world, a giant that needed some direction and another strong leader. That's a quick look at the fraternity. Now let's look at the national scene that this fraternity was getting ready to enter during that time. After a slight post-war recession, 1920 to 21, the economy began an upward movement that was so fast and furious that is actually scary. These years were known as the Roaring Twenties. Materialism was taking over from the old Victorian ways of the past. Radio was the new means of communication. Lindbergh's flight across the Atlantic created a new wave of Americanism. Women gained the right to vote, and some of these newly liberated ladies were called flappers during those days. Movies were the main entertainment venue. Prohibition was not working. Booze flowed freely. So this is the national scene. I've described this and both the fraternity and the country. And so now let's focus on McAlester Scottish Rite situation in the Roaring Twenties. I have described this time period in previous talks about McAlester Scottish Rite as the decade of spending. McAlester membership the increase was not as dramatic as the national figures just quoted, but they were still pretty strong. From 1910 we had 1,300 members, and by 1920 we had 6,132 members. So, pretty good increase. The optimism was rampant, and talk of the future at McAlester, future membership in McAlester, was in the 20,000 member plus. This is what people were thinking. The Albert Pike Lodge of Perfection, which is now the McAlester Lodge of Perfection, which is what we are right here tonight, took on the following projects. Construction of a 55-room dormitory in McAlester to house out-of-town members at a cost of approximately $75,000. Construction of a huge dormitory in Norman called the White Hand Hall to house students who were children of Masons, approximately $250,000. Remodel a 55-room dormitory, which had been built earlier in the decade, into a hospital for an additional cost of $200,000. So, to this point, with those expenditures, that's about $500,000 worth of construction. And then in 1928, they began construction on a new temple, which eventually cost approximately $600,000. This is what you would call ambitious planning to take care of that proposed future membership of 20,000. It would be safe to say the nation and the Scottish Rite, from top to bottom, were on a fast pace. We'll now take a look at this new leader, the one that is now placed on the same high pedestal as Pike and Richardson from the point of view of history. John Henry Coles was born at Dripping Springs, Kentucky August the 22nd, 1863, right during the middle of the Civil War. His father, Joseph, was a merchant and an enthusiastic Mason. The family later moved to Louisville. After attending Cumberland University, John became a successful businessman, a captain in the Kentucky militia, which basically was their National Guard, and he was raised as a master mason in 1888 at the age of 25. He received the Scottish Rite degrees in 1890, and 7 years later received his 33rd degree. In 1909, he was elected to the Supreme Council, and then 2 years later, he was elevated to the position of Secretary General, which he held for the next 10 years. He was a lifelong bachelor, strong-willed and willing to fight for what he thought was right and proper. He was short, 5 foot 5 inches tall, and stocky in appearance. So in the 1921 biennial, Moore resigned, and at the age of 58, Coles was elected Sovereign Grand Commander. At that same meeting, the Supreme Council decided to meet every year, rather than once every 2 years, as had been done in the past. And so this system of meeting every year, instead of the biennial years on the odd years, like had been done before, continued until 1929, when the practice was discontinued and the biennial sessions were reinstalled. John Henry Coles' first full year as Grand Commander was 1922. The post-war recession had just ended. Masonry in general, and the Scottish Rite in particular, continued their upward spiral. He had no problem with numbers, such as members and money. He just needed to keep these numbers directed toward a common goal and perhaps even redefine that goal. Southern jurisdiction membership, as mentioned previously, was at 200,000 in 1921. By 1925, it had increased to 248,000. The fraternity was in great shape financially. The headquarters building, the House of the Temple, was built and by this time paid for. So most of the income was placed in government bonds. With money to spend, we found the Scottish Rite changing from a course of ritual to one of service and philanthropy. The focus on the philosophical and allegorical ritual and the moral improvement of man shifted to financial help to others. Now this is really an interesting stat which surprised me. I suspect it'll do the same with you. Up till now, we've been talking about and describing the southern jurisdiction in all these numbers. In the mid-1920s, the northern jurisdiction was larger in membership than the southern jurisdiction. As a matter of fact, the northern jurisdiction was the largest of any Supreme Council in the world at that time. Even though they only covered 15 states, these states had the largest concentration of the population in the nation. There have been numerous attempts to join or consolidate these two jurisdictions, but to no avail. The main sticking points, now listen to this is really, the main sticking points between the two bodies was and would remain for many years the question of whether or not the Maundy Thursday ceremony was open to the public. The northern jurisdiction was using the same script, but held open meetings to include family and friends. And then secondarily, the northern group had tampered to a degree with some of the Pike's degrees. So it was same message, but using more recent names such as Benjamin Franklin and Abraham Lincoln in their characters. But the primary problem was the Maundy Thursday issue. And this is inconceivable to me today, especially in the light of the fact that in 1980, the southern jurisdiction allowed the open policy, and yet still no consolidation. So as a personal note to me, There must be some hidden problem that we're not aware of as to why these two jurisdictions did not go together. Some people say this is still a carryover from the old Civil War. Surely not. Surely not, after all these years. Anyway, by 1927, the economy was still on the rise, but a few red flags appeared to the Scottish Rite. There was a growing number gap between membership in the LOP and the consistory. Even with those 1925 figures I gave you earlier that said that there was 248,000 members in the consistory, or 32nd degree Masons, at that same time there were 290,000 members in the Lodge of Perfection. Now this would indicate that candidates were taking the first 14 degrees but not finishing. Another flag was that all fraternal organizations, Elks, Oddfellows, and so forth, were all declining in membership during these mid-1920s. The worst flag, or sign of a future problem, was that basic masonry, the Blue Lodge, numbers were in a decline. And so, finally in 1928, the Scottish Rite saw its last year of real growth, and 1929 was the first down year in membership numbers. Now this is before the economic collapse of Wall Street on October the 24th of 1929. So, switching back to the local McAlester scene, did our forefather Masons who had begun construction of this McAlester temple know of these disturbing facts? It makes you wonder. I've run out of time, so I'll leave you with the old movie serials, like the old movie serials, that would end an episode with the heroine clinging to a tree limb hanging over the edge of a cliff. Tune in next month to see what happened. Now this was going to be the end, but I had to leave. I couldn't leave there. I had a few postscripts that I have to put in here. This period we have just described has covered basic masonry and Scottish Rite masonry in its glory days, the period of phenomenal growth. Most people think that membership soared because economic times were unusually good. And this normally held theory, it must obviously not be correct. Even though the great growth of the 19-teens and 1920s, they were experiencing absenteeism in the lodge rooms and at reunions. Thus, many historians are led to believe that Masonry, and particularly Scottish Rite, had become symbolic or a status symbol rather than a participatory organization. How this double-edged sword, that is the membership decline accompanied by the economic collapse, be handled? Stay tuned. Thank you.